Thank you.
So I should say this is a particular pleasure for me. Often when you do these things, you have to pretend you know the work of the writers, but in this case, I actually grew up in Treme, and I lived in Washington and was a huge fan of George's work. So thanks for being here. Why don't, before we show a clip, why don't you all just talk a little bit about the Deuce, sort of how the idea evolved, and also just tell people a little bit about what it's about.
David?
When we were working on Treme, the locations manager, of all people, approached us and said he had been talking to someone who had been integral in Times Square at that moment where Times Square became the home of a nascent new semi-legitimate and then legitimate product, which was pornography. And they had been a mob front, and they had been intimately involved in that sort of pioneering moment, for lack of a better word. And we should talk to him because there was a real story in it. And George and I were extremely reluctant. It sounded gratuitous. As I say it, it sounds gratuitous. And we were dubious that we really wanted to do any kind of show about that. And he kept pressing us, the fellow kept pressing us, and we finally met with the surviving one of these twin brothers who had been sort of so critical to that moment. And he started telling us stories. We were sitting in an apartment in Tribeca, and slowly, reluctantly, we pulled out notepads and started taking notes. And I think 3 hours later, we made an excuse that we needed to go for a walk and so we could talk. And I said, my God, I think we're going to end up doing a show about Times Square and about the rise of pornography.
Wow.
And so we backed into it.
Wow.
And that was maybe 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, it was a while back.
Yeah.
And what really drew us in were the characters that he was describing and their fates and their arcs and so on. This guy was sort of unusual for his time in that he was very open-minded about people in general. And so the bar that he had became a meeting place for all kinds of, working people, pimps, prostitutes, porn actors, transgender, cops, attorneys, all kinds of freaks washed up on his door, and they were welcome there. And that was real attractive to us also, is this huge cast of sort of outsiders.
Full-blown demi-mod. But it was also the theater district. I mean, there was also normalcy. Yeah. People would come in into that place, and then he ended up running a lot of other things that were not so benign. But
why don't we see a clip of it?
Sure.
Should we do that?
Hey, baby brother. You still betting? Winning.
Come on. See how long that lasts. You could do what they do.
I know I could, but would I?
I wouldn't want to make you feel like a thing.
You're smarter than you let on.
Who's your man?
No man, just me.
How's that work?
You gotta work a little harder. You gotta be a little more careful.
I'm running a legitimate business here.
The center of things now. I'm building something.
There's been a change in the law about community standards.
What about community standards?
Apparently, New York has none.
Scary world out here, babe.
Go home. If you stay, you'll die.
There's gonna be an opportunity coming your way.
All I can say is it's gonna be good.
What am I looking at?
The future.
When do we start?
It's great.
Well, that's a teaser.
So, in this work, in your books, certainly in The Wire and other shows, vice, crime, why there seem to be great vehicles to tell stories about cities. Why? Why are those particular, I mean, there are a lot of prisms through which you can look at cities. Why those? Why are they so illuminating about cities?
I mean, every city has its own voice and its own signature, you know. And as far as the crime thing goes, for me, I wrote crime novels because I needed the conflict is stuff of drama, right? And it's life or death is the highest form of conflict. But it's just a you know, it's just a vehicle to hang all these other social ideas that I want to talk about. It's just a vehicle for that.
Yeah, I feel as if I began on a police beat at a newspaper in Baltimore. And the one thing that became apparent to me was that all the fault lines that are actually there in society, all of the, whatever the disconnect is between who we say we are as a people and who we actually are when push comes to shove, they all evidence themselves in the street. And they usually do at the point of crime is the sort of the boiling point. But if you scratch it down past the this happened yesterday, police said, if you sort of follow the lives and the arcs and to an extent follow the money, you start to get what's really ailing us and what is sort of driving a lot of the dysfunction and some of the function of an American city. And since, I mean, I think George found this with his writing as well. We're an urban people now. We're not going, you know, that whole notion of the ideal American is has small town values. I mean, they peddle that every election cycle.
Right.
But the actual, you know, 80% of us live in metro areas, more than that.
Right.
And we're oriented towards the city, and that's who we are, for better or for worse. We're either going to figure it out or we're going to fail.
Cities are, I mean, in a lot of fiction and in a lot of movies, cities are a backdrop. But I think for you guys, and maybe talk about your books for a second, I actually think cities are the stars. I mean, when I lived in Washington, and I didn't live in the Washington that's in that you wrote about, but I recognize that Washington and the actual places. Talk a little bit about what cities mean for you. How do you live? Where do you live?
I live, well, if you know DC, I live off of Georgia Avenue, way uptown, right over the district line.
Yeah.
For me, you know, it goes back to like sort of the biblical moment was the '68 riots in Washington. They came right after the King assassination, and several corridors in the city burned down. And I was 11 years old, and so my dad had a diner downtown. And after the riots were over that summer, he said, "It's time for you to go to work." So back in that day, you could say to a kid, "Go up to the corner, catch the bus downtown, transfer to the F Street line, take that across town, and meet your father and go to work." So the bus went down Georgia Avenue, and after Georgia Avenue had burned all the way down to 7th Street at Massachusetts Avenue. You know, for an 11-year-old kid, I didn't know what had happened really intellectually, but I saw something in a sensory way that really impacted me greatly. And what it was is that, you know, Washington was a black city. When I was growing up, it was 75 to 80% black. And the people on the bus were working class black Washingtonians primarily. And after the riots, they looked different to this kid. They were standing straighter. They were wearing louder clothing. You know, the attitude was different. And I knew that a rain had come and cleared the streets. And then that summer, working for my father, I was delivering food all over the city on foot, and experiencing all these things made me fall in love with the city and become interested in. I mean, I knew then that I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to write about Washington, D.C. someday.
Right. You both write about race, I think, particularly compellingly, and it's not easy to do. In the Deuce, your characters, your black characters, just as an example, are just well written, rounded. Talk a little bit about writing about race.
You got to write everybody as if they're a person. It sounds simple, but you can't approach anybody and say, well, this guy's a cop or this guy's a drug dealer, or this guy's a pimp, or this guy's a patrolman, or this person's a housewife. You sort of got to begin with a person, and then you work your way out, and whatever different vernacular, whatever backstory would be different because of race. You know, the stuff gets grafted on that has to do with race, but you begin from the premise of, like, the worst thing we can do is, you know, in this piece, by nature of the reality of the world, is that, with one exception, the pimps, the 8th Avenue pimps, are all African American. And I think we took great pride in the idea that all these guys are going to sound different, and all these guys are going to be different. And even within the context of this stunted world, of this place in which, you know, exploitation is the daily dynamic, we have to create 4 human beings who are completely credible as human beings. That's I mean, that's your job. That's all that is.
Right.
So I lived in New York during this period because I was in college in New York in the 70s, as I was telling David backstage, and I live in New York now. People who live in New York now will not recognize this New York. Talk a little bit about that. When you walk around the New York, you probably could, my guess is you couldn't find a setting at all in filming that actually was in New York, right?
We had to use parts of New York for parts that didn't exist, and there were parts that could only exist with heavy computer-generated imagery. We had to I mean, our 42nd and 8th Avenue from 1971, we shot it in Washington Heights.
Right.
Up in the 160s. And because the width of the streets was the same, roughly, and it was flat, and the architecture of the buildings was approximate, and we could do certain things with computers. But there is no piece of Times Square in 1971 or 77 that exists anymore.
Right.
You know, I think we shot a few scenes on 30th and 38th near here, but, you know, West Side, generic. Nothing that was iconic exists anymore in the same way.
So do you look at the, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a period piece. I mean, it's about a different New York than exists now. We're writing about a place in time, but it's not a reflection so much on today's New York as it is on a moment in times in terms of capitalism and misogyny and a lot of other things that were our topics.
Right. Even if it's not a comment, or maybe it is a comment, even if it's not a reflection on today's New York, you can't look at this New York, especially for the people who won't remember this New York, and live in today's New York, which is richer,
right.
Significantly richer. I mean, there are parts of this New York that look, to me, you would never have thought of having a Disney operation
Absolutely.
in Times Square. Proselytize a little bit. Talk a little bit about, that's the wrong word. Talk a little bit about how you feel about the New York of today versus that New York, or is it just a matter of craft? Did you come away thinking, here's what feels different to me?
To me, New York is it's kind of a unicorn, and there's a couple of unicorns in the country. DC, in some ways, not the DC that George spent a lifetime chronicling, but. Well, not your whole lifetime. You've got some years left.
Thank you.
As best we know. But DC has an artificial economy, which is the federal government.
Right.
New York has an artificial economy in that it's the cultural and economic capital of America. And so, you know, listen, it's the safest city. You know, of all the places that I hang out, this is the place where, you know, it's got a remarkable economy that is impervious to the things that's affecting second-tier cities all through America. I used to laugh at the number of murders on all of the Law and Order shows because like, they had more murders in Manhattan than I think you had more murders in Manhattan just on a single season of the show. And a city like Baltimore or New Orleans, where we filmed as well. They're experiencing a different urban dynamic than New York. There's very little that New York can bring to other cities that, you know, when you try to export a lot of your policies and a lot of your strategies. When it doesn't come with the money, when Wall Street isn't North Avenue or Wall Street isn't Magazine Street, it doesn't work. You know, Comstat doesn't work the same way in Baltimore. It doesn't achieve the same results because it's not coming with a 30-year run-up on Wall Street. That's basically rebuilding the city. So I'm very wary of making New York symbolic of anything other than New York and possibly West LA and DC. Those few places that are impervious to economic forces that affect everywhere else.
Right. George, a question about craft. I think one of the things that, I told you how much I like the cut backstage. One of the things that is so powerful about your writing about Washington, which I'm not sure anybody else captures about Washington. I feel like I'm reading the work of a person who lived there. I didn't know your background until you described your background in Washington. Is it hard to transfer that deep knowledge of one American city to another? Do you like show up in a New York or a New Orleans or wherever else you're writing about and say, this is like going to take me a while. I don't know that history of the riots that you described.
Well, yeah, but I'm not afraid, you know, or hesitant. I like to do what I do in Washington, which is immediately get out there, start walking around, really just listening to people rather than talk to people. And you know, New Orleans, when I got off the plane, I fell in love with it because it was very much like Washington in a lot of ways, the Washington of my youth. And so I was out all the time. And then in New York, you know, you know, you have this miracle, this subway system up here, which you guys are going to laugh, but I was very taken by the subway, and I was, you know, as soon as I got here, and I knew I was going to be living here for about 6 or 7 months, I wanted to learn it and go everywhere, and that was my entertainment when I wasn't working, which was not often, but I would pick like a Greek diner that I would read about, and I'd get on the subway on a Saturday night, and I'd go to another part of town, and you know, I know it's real exciting for everybody to listen to that, but you know, it's what I like to do, or go to a store and walk around all day or something, or and I have to say about public transportation is that in Washington, the metro opened 40 years ago in 1976, and it took many years, but it was the impetus for Washington coming back from the riots, because what the riots did was it was extreme white flight. All the downtown shopping district closed. There was, you know, tumbleweeds blowing across the street. But wherever there was a metro stop, or what you call a subway stop, it started blooming again. And a place like Baltimore, which doesn't really have a viable public transportation system, has been crippled by that. And New York is, you know, I just think it's like a miracle that I would get off a set in Bay Ridge at 4 in the morning, and I'd walk to a stop somewhere, and I'd be home in my apartment in Midtown Manhattan, guaranteed. You know what I mean? And that's one of the things I really enjoyed, that and the food. Food's incredible.
By the way, this is striking their ears because of the subway problems you guys are having this summer.
Well,
Yeah, no, it's
I laughed about
in Baltimore,
He said it was 4 in the morning. It's easier.
We envy your subway problems. We want to have a subway that can have your problems.
Well, I mean, the Washington Post did a big article yesterday about all the problems of your subway recently and how it related to ours, and that people are laughing about your problems because we've given up on our subway system. I don't ride it anymore because you can't get to where you want to go.
So each of you has plumbed cities. Cities has been a dominant character in your books and in your movies and television. So just reflect a little bit about cities. You obviously love cities. I think you both live in cities. You both live in not necessarily the obvious cities or the obvious parts of cities. What do you want to tell people about what's wrong with cities, what's good about cities? What do you want to say to people who are thinking a lot about American cities and their future?
I do love cities. I first got to live in a city when I got hired at the Baltimore Sun. I'd grown up in the suburbs, and I always felt, I grew up near where George lives now, a few hundred yards from the district line, but it was Montgomery County, and I went to a perfectly benign suburban existence. And then suddenly I became the police reporter in a very dysfunctional city in a lot of ways. But it was the most extraordinary journey through multicultural and sort of varying classes of people compacted together. And the improbabilities that would come to you as you walked out of your door, or as you got out of your car on a given intersection. As a reporter, I fell in love with that. I mean, the idea of, I don't know what's going to happen or what somebody's going to say when I walk into this bar, you know, on North Carey Street, or, you know, it was exhilarating. I mean, I remember.
You're making me miss being a Metro reporter, by the way.
You know, best job in journalism, Metro reporter. When I was there 2 years, they put me out in Howard County, which is not only is it like halfway between Washington and Baltimore, but it's where they built the planned city of Columbia. So everything sort of makes sense in terms of planning, and you know, they put me out there for 2 weeks, and I wrapped my arms around the city editor's legs and said, "Bring me home." You know, every story was like zoning and school boards. It was like, oh my God, you know, they think about everything here. Everything's, you know, if it goes slightly wrong, then they make it go right the next day, and they throw money at the problem. And there's something about a city and the improbabilities of a city, and yet the more seriously I began to look at the cities, I realized this is where our future is. Either we figure this out and how to live together, and how to do this with the very imprecise and ruthless vehicle that is capitalism, and we figure out how to mitigate that in ways that can construct a viable society. Either we figure that out, or we're headed for a very coarse future, right, and brutal future. So it's all there. It's like, you know, this is, when cities succeed, I'm fascinated by it. When cities fail, it's equally fascinating and terrifying.
You want to take a cut at that?
What was the question again?
Well, let me ask you. I'll ask you a different one.
Okay.
So talk a little bit about, what would you say to a critic, particularly a conservative critic, who watches the show and says, you know, your city, the New York you portray, or the, you know, Baltimore you portrayed, that's a rough place. That in fact fits Donald Trump's description of cities as these sort of crime-ridden nightmares. What would you say to that critic?
Well, I mean, I don't. Here's what I would say about Baltimore, is that it was just one part of the city that we were discussing, and there's different people that, you know, it's their job to cover the other parts, just like it's my job to cover Washington east of the Anacostia River, not the high ground in Northwest. So in Baltimore, you know, you've got people like Laura Lippman writing about it, yeah, and Ann Tyler. And, you know, with all of us writing about Baltimore together, then that's a complete.
So you're writing a chapter of Baltimore?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
That's right.
I think I'm supposed to open it up for questions now. Adam?
Any questions? Sir in the middle? Sorry, we're just going to try and get a microphone to you, and if you can please introduce yourself.
We can hear him.
Hi, Glenn Miller.
Hi.
With every city having some version of a brand manager, I wonder, do you ever receive pushback on the way you depict their cities?
Yes.
Has it inhibited your writing, or have you had to change scenes? Or?
No. I don't mean to be monosyllabic, but we all live in a political world, and I operate in a political world, and you know, I've been telling stories about cities now through various incarnations of the governments, particularly in Baltimore, and there's always there's a political lifespan in which a reformer comes in and asserts for all the same problems that some of what we're doing dramatically assert for. And we're in complete symbiosis and in complete agreement with whoever the new guy is, and he's going to fix it. And then 6 months after he's in office, it's all fixed, and we've got to stop writing about it. And nobody ever attends to long-term issues and structures and paradigms like the drug war or schools or the decline of the Fourth Amendment, or, it's all just, the people in charge of places like Baltimore are riding from one headline to the next and hoping it doesn't devour them. So the mayor, 6 months after he was the mayor, was already thinking about how to become a governor. And, so Baltimore was already a miracle 6 months after he took, never mind that he was hiding the stats or that he was making stuff up, or it didn't matter. There was a political narrative to be told. So I can't take that stuff seriously. I mean, the part of me that used to be a newspaper reporter says, that's full of shit, and I have to hold it over here and just have to do my job. But I get interested when I hear any civic leader discuss an actual issue or a construct that I know is flawed, something like the drug war or something like mass arrest, which was tried in Baltimore to an extremity. When I hear somebody actually addressing what's really gone wrong, my ears perk up, but it's few and far between when that happens.
Quick question for David that came in over email. You started out as a journalist. Do you think TV writing is a more powerful medium to create social or political change?
Don't answer that.
I was just going to add. Yeah,
just teasing. Go ahead.
Remember whose house you're in here.
You gave this answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, we were just talking about it. I just think, when if you're to say, well, if you're to write a newspaper article to say that this is what's happening in the schools in Baltimore and these are the statistics, it's far less powerful than, in my opinion, than watching season 4 of The Wire and watching those kids go through a school year in Baltimore. It's just because the emotions of drama but look, I'm a lifelong, everyday reader of the Washington Post. I think the newspaper is a fantastic newspaper, and I'm 100% behind the profession. And if anything good has come out of this the last 6 months, it's that newspapers have gotten stronger, I think, and people will read newspapers again.
Yeah. Question from the audience. Right here, please. You get a microphone.
Yes, my name's Kazembe Batts. You spoke about in '68 when Martin Luther King was assassinated, how that influenced your life. And my brother on the right, he talks a lot about Baltimore, where because of a police killing, there was a disturbances, a rebellion about 2 years ago. There's a film coming out called Detroit, later on this summer. My question, which speaks about what happened in 1968 with the uprising. So my question is, as creative people, what do you think could be a solution to not the problem of the uprisings, but the cause of it, which is often police-community relations or unnecessary deaths of black people by police officers? What would you say to that?
For the last 10, 15 years, since I worked on a book about one open-air drug corner and the policing of that corner in Baltimore, the book came out in '97. The journalism was from '93. Since that book came out, so I guess it's actually 20 years now. I should update. I've been firmly advocating that we have to abandon the drug war. We have to walk away from this disaster, this absolute affront, not only to civil liberties, but it has led to a level of over-policing and brutalization that it trains police to do the wrong thing. It trains police not to do the thing that is absolutely essential to the lifeblood of a city, which is solve those crimes that actually hurt people. And instead, they make stats. it destroyed the police department in my city of Baltimore. And it taught generations of cops how not to do the job you actually need cops to do. It led indirectly and directly to the moment of Freddie Gray, which is a population and a cohort that had been totally over-policed for generations and brutalized and denied even the basic construct of the Fourth Amendment. You couldn't sit on your own stoop in Baltimore without taking a charge. You know, police were basically not policing territory to protect territory. They weren't policing their posts to protect their posts. They were just harvesting human beings as stats, and sometimes for the most meager charges. And 100,000 arrests a year in a city of 630,000. I mean, ridiculous numbers. And so when the spark finally happened, and you had somebody die in the back of a police wagon, for reasons that are complicated and not, we could go hours talking about what the hell happened or didn't happen in the back of that wagon. But it was indicative of the loss of young African-American lives and the indifference that the drug war had shown to that cohort. So the city exploded. And since then, since that moment, Baltimore has gone from being, having, many struggles with crime, but it's gone to being the second most violent city in America from the moment of Freddie Gray. I mean, from that month, the crime stats go like this. From the month, I mean, it's just, you can look at it, you can look it up. And it's because upon being confronted with the fact that they had to change and they had to police the city without violating the rights of a cohort, they couldn't do it. And so the police have now stayed in their cars. They won't get out of their cars. They won't monitor their corners. They won't actually do any police work, almost in protest because of the charges that were brought against those officers. So now we're not being policed. And now the loss of life in my city is the worst it's ever been in the history of the city per capita. So got to walk away from the drug war. Got to throw it in the gutter and leave it there and figure out a way to police people as human beings without relying on this reckless war that's rooted in racism and social control.
Last question, 20 seconds. Have you guys considered telling the story of the political divide that we're living in right now, the divide between rural and urban areas?
No.
But the night is young, right?
Well, there's probably a great dramatic series in someplace like Martinsburg, West Virginia, as you were talking, in the opioid epidemic. There probably is something, somebody should be paying attention because there's probably a good piece of work to be done there dramatically. Obviously, there's been some great journalism. The book Dreamland is an excellent address of it journalistically, but there's probably some drama that should follow on the heels. I don't know if it's going to be us, but it should be something.
Yeah, we've talked about it.
Great. All right, back to you, Dean.
Great, thank you. This was a
Thank you.
pleasure. And
Thanks,
it was a great
everybody.
show.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. It's fun. Yeah, sure.